that macro data in the first place. And as we all know, government fudges those statistics as much as possible on a normal basis. But during an election cycle, they have extra incentive to fudge away. Listen, the economy's not doing very well. We can see that in the services reports. We can see it in the manufacturing reports. We can see it in the import-export data. We can see it all over the place. So no, it's not doing well. And of course, we have a stock and a bond market that are priced for a world of very, very high and rapid growth. That's not the world we're in. So somebody's got this wrong. And of course, that's what you get when you misprice the price of money. Everything gets distorted.
Now, I wanted to talk about housing just for a sec, because all over the corporate media, the government, I mean, they're just continually pushing the idea that the housing market is just booming out there. And when I look around, I'm looking at housing almost every day, and I see many areas where the prices of houses are starting to come down and houses are staying on the market longer and longer. When you're looking at the housing market, what are you seeing right now?
I'm seeing a number of markets that have rebubbled and are in the process of rolling over. It's a mystery to me why the media or even relatively astute observers are missing the pattern. It's an easy pattern. Prices get really far away from median income. You know, a house has no intrinsic value unless there's jobs there that can support it ultimately, right? Chicago is about to learn that. Detroit just proved that. But you look at some of the hot bubble markets out there, again, which could be Las Vegas, could be San Francisco, Palo Alto, you name it. These are places where the median income and median house price got so far apart from each other that everybody should know what happens next. Spoiler alert, the incomes don't go up. Here's what we saw last time, and here's what we've seen in every bubble asset market ever. First, there's a big speculative fervor. There's all these stories that come out that reinforce the dynamic. You get these really insane prices. Everybody starts justifying, rationalizing those insane prices. The very first thing that gives up is the volume starts to roll over. So all of a sudden you note that not as many homes are being sold. And usually in a real estate market, it's not across the board. We have to look at subsectors. So sometimes the really cheap houses continue to sell well for a while and the expensive ones slow down. So you have to sort of look at the market with a little granularity, but you see at least one or more classes of that real estate market begin to sit on the market longer and longer. And then, of course, the realtors come out and say, there's no worries here because, look, prices are still good. But, of course, prices are the second thing to come down in that story. We saw that happen in Vancouver in fairly spectacular fashion recently, and that's ongoing. Canada's housing market bubbles put the United States ones to shame. They're just like off the charts. Australia, even more off the charts if that's possible. So, yeah, the United States has some bubble markets. They're rolling. I expect that to continue. We're going to see that really pick up steam in the months ahead. And again, it was simply what you get when the Federal Reserve misprices money, and they did it directly, aggressively targeting the mortgage market to drive rates down so that people could, air quotes here, afford more house. That helps to drag prices up. That's a self-reinforcing process. And when that Saturn rocket no longer, is going to be clearing the launch pad, volume goes down first, prices second.
You mentioned the Fed. And we know the Fed is looking at the economy, they're looking at unemployment, and they keep looking at inflation target of 2%. Now, I see inflation in different areas. Why is the Fed so concerned about their inflation target?
Well, the Fed is targeting inflation because the banking system seems to perform better when you've got a reasonable amount of inflation baked in. And to understand why, you kind of have to understand how the banking system works. Now, most people would think, oh my gosh, if I was a bank, I wouldn't want to loan money and then get it back and have it be worth less, would I? Well, the answer is actually you would. So most people are clueless about how the banking system works. They think, oh, I put $1,000 in the bank and maybe the bank loans 900 of my dollars to somebody else. That's not how it works. The bank loans money to whoever they feel like is a good prospect, and then later they'll find the reserves for that. So when a bank makes a loan, let's call it a $250,000 mortgage loan to somebody, that $250,000 just came out of thin air, right? Mm-hmm. So that bank is now going to be earning, whatever, we'll make a number up, 3.5% on that. You're like, well, that's pretty good money. But then where does that 250,000 go? Well, it goes right back into a bank somewhere. And then let's just say it goes back into the same bank. The bottom line is that bank could basically loan out that same $250,000 as many times as it has clients that want to borrow that makes sense to the bank. So that when you say, wow, the bank's earning 3.5%, that doesn't sound that great. But if they loan out that same tranche of money 10 times, they're actually making 35% on the same block of money. And so for a bank that manufactures money out of thin air, they need inflation so that the whole system stays stable. The Federal Reserve is not here for your benefit or my benefit. When they say they want inflation, it's not because you need it or I want it. They're doing it for the banking system. The banking system does better. So when we look at it through that lens, the Fed is working really hard to create inflation, but at the same time, they're a little hamstrung. Because the U.S. government doesn't actually want to report inflation for two reasons. One, higher inflation rate means you get to report a lower real GDP number because inflation is subtracted from GDP to give us the so-called real GDP. And second, cost of living adjustments or COLAs are geared and hinged to inflation. So the Fed has their own little pet version of inflation that they get to track. They call it, the core or personal consumption expenditures. They're looking at a core inflation number. The federal government's looking at CPI. It's all a mess. None of them even remotely track people's actual experience with inflation, which is at least 4 or 5% right now, as far as I'm concerned, unless you live in a major metropolitan area and you're elderly and you are living on you have a lot of prescription medicines as part of your life. You might be experiencing 10% or more inflation if you're renting and have a high medical exposure. So yes, if the Fed wants inflation because it helps banks and helps the exponential loan process continue for a little longer.
And you're right. The Fed isn't really working for the people. They're working for banks themselves. And you wrote this article called Sorry Losers. Mm-hmm. How the Fed has screwed the many to benefit the few. Who are the losers in this?
So the losers are, because the Fed mispriced money, dragged interest rates down to zero, so you're a loser. If you have a demand account in a bank, it's either savings or checking, because you can demand that money anytime you want. You're probably getting zero or something so close to zero, let's call it zero. So you're a loser because you used to be getting 3 or 4, maybe even 5% on that money in times past. You're no longer getting any return on your money in the bank, so you're losing out on that interest income. You are losing out, especially if you are an endowment. If you're a pension, the pensions are just getting crushed in this whole low money environment. You're a loser if you're a first-time home buyer as well, because the Fed targeted getting house prices back up, thinking erroneously that creates wealth. It doesn't. It just creates more expensive housing. So if you're a first-time home buyer, you can't get into these markets. You've been priced out because the prices have been lifted. In fact, even if you're an existing homeowner, you might feel wealthier because your house is now worth $600,000 instead of $400,000, but you're not, because your house is still where you live, and now it has higher insurance costs on it because, quote, it's worth more, and you might have higher property taxes. The only way you win in a higher housing price market is if you sell that house, you move to a lower housing price market, and you pocket the difference. Everybody else is actually a loser in this story, even though they feel wealthier. So these are all people. So really, the Fed threw Granny under the bus, said if you're living on a fixed income, if you're a retiree, if you're a saver, if you're somebody who requires a rate of return to meet fiduciary responsibilities on some long-dated horizons, endowments, pensions, we're going to target you for losing. This includes all the money in the money market funds. It includes life insurance policy holders, right? So if you have term life, you have a premium. The premium is based on some calculations. If you read the fine print carefully, the life insurance company says, hey, these calculations depend on us getting some sort of a return on this money. People this year have gotten increases in their term life bills of anywhere from 10% to 200%, the highest numbers I've heard so far, increases in their premiums. Why? Because that's what the insurance companies have to charge in order to get their fiduciary actuarial responsibilities in line. Those are just some of the many losers, but 99% of the people in this story are losers.
So when we look at everything that the Fed has been doing, we can see right now that the benefit is really to the banks. And the banks right now they have a lot of derivatives on their books. Deutsche Bank, Citi, JP Morgan Chase, they have trillions worth of derivatives. Now, if this derivative market collapses, what impact would this have on the global economy?
Well, it would destroy it as we know it. It would destroy the financial system, and of course, the economy runs with the help of the financial system. If you need a clear example of that happened recently, it was the collapse of the seventh largest bulk shipper in the world, ocean shipping company, Hanjin, and they went bankrupt. They no longer had letters of credit. They no longer could. The ships couldn't dock. Everything that was in transit just got stuck out at sea because the financial system was no longer willing to support that portion of the physical, tangible economy, and so it stopped working. So the financial system itself is heavily exposed. This was a conceit that began under Greenspan. It was I think the worst piece of thinking ever. The mumbler in chief at the time was not as smart as people gave him credit for. He thought, rather erroneously, that derivatives enabled us to not only control risk, but eliminate risk. Now, I believe in a different rule of risk, which is more on the transitive rule, which is risk can neither be created nor destroyed. It can be hidden. It can be transferred. It can be spread around a little, but it's still there. Otherwise, we've created nirvana. It's a riskless world. Doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. So because banks have derivatives, they think they're allowed to run and conduct their balance sheet operations as if the risk is actually gone, though. From a regulatory standpoint, if you and I each exchange $1 billion in credit default swaps, which is a form of derivative, and neither of us actually have $1 billion, neither of us actually own the underlying credit default swap, both of us get to say, hey, I'm hedged. I could go out and buy $1 billion worth of these credit instruments. Let's say it's Portuguese 10-year debt, and I'm totally covered because you have the other side of this bet. I get to, regulatorily speaking, get to point to this and say, look, I don't have any exposure. Even though I have a $1 billion of Portuguese 10-year debt, I have no exposure. Because I have no exposure, I can lever up even higher. So that's the game that's been played. And of course, the derivatives are a game that work perfectly. They absolutely control every ounce of risk until risk rears its head, and then we discover they don't work, right? And we've already discovered that they don't work when Greece went into default on a tranche of its 10-year debt. When was that? 3-4 years ago. And the ruling body on derivatives had to shut the market down, didn't declare a default, even though Greece had missed debt payments, which is the very definition of a default, until 3 or 4 months had passed. And that's how long it took them to take about $78 billion of notional credit default swaps, which had an underlying value at risk of about $3 billion, maybe $1.8 billion when everything was settled. That $3 to $1.8 billion was serious enough change with enough counterparty risk that they couldn't figure out how to settle it for a few months. Now, $78 billion, I should point out, is literally 1/1000th as much of the derivative exposure that just Citi is carrying alone on its books at this point in time.
You mentioned the shipping company Hanjin, and we can see right now deliveries of goods, they're delayed for weeks or maybe a month or so because of what is happening with the shipping company. Do you see this spreading to other shipping companies? Do you see this spreading to maybe the trucking industry or the rail industry where credit maybe will dry up or these companies will go bankrupt and we won't get the deliveries to the stores or, to the markets?
Well, yeah, there's plenty of pressure out there. Listen, I expect to see this sort of this is exactly why the Fed won't let the market go down. I mean, today is another case in point. Just staring at my screen, it's Groundhog Day out here in the equity markets. What do we see? We see anytime there's any selling happening at all, mysteriously it just gets reversed. Not U-turned, but nipple bottom, just the other direction. Somebody steps in and buys this market repeatedly and constantly to keep it going up. We had 2 major rescues, one a year ago in August, another one in January of this year. So those major rescues were clearly engineered by the central banks. And the reason they need to do that is because corporations have taken, here's another future group of losers. Right now they look like winners, but trust me, they're future losers. The corporations that have taken this low price of money signal and gone out and performed vast, enormous financial engineering on their balance sheets by borrowing an extraordinary amount of money, taking that money and using it to buy back their shares, or do other things that would otherwise expose them to a lot of leverage in their businesses. Hanjin is just an example of a company that was highly leveraged, ran into some normal real world variability in the business cycle, and got crushed by it. I'm expecting to see a lot more of that simply because there are so many companies that are so heavily levered up at this point in time. Corporate debt has never been higher. The news, when it does talk about corporations, always talks about the cash on the balance sheet. That's great, but you got to talk about the debt on the balance sheet too. On a net basis, this is about as heavily geared up as we've ever seen corporations be. And this is all, again, courtesy of the Fed. So when, not if, but when the next business cycle comes along, it's going to run headlong into corporations that have the most amount of debts on the books that we've ever seen. It's going to crush a bunch of them, but don't worry, a lot of credit default swaps have been written against that debt, so the banks are safe.
So do you think the banks, you're saying the banks are safe?
No, I was being very facetious there.
But
can't help myself.
The banks right now, the Fed and the government, they're all telling us that the banks are fine, that don't worry about it. They're passing the stress test. They're absolutely fine. We all know they're insolvent. But when the banks do fail, should people be worried about their deposits in the banks?
Well, absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. I mean, there's still people with money in Greek banks. I don't even remotely understand what they're smoking. Everybody should be out of those banks. And that includes Italian banks and Spanish banks and Portuguese banks. In fact, lots of banks, because the banking system is heavily exposed at this point in time. Now, the extent to which you're safe is the extent to which the government of the country in which you live, so I'll talk in the United States for the moment because it's where I live, the extent to which the FDIC is actually going to honor the deposit guarantees and limits, right? So, if you have over $250,000 in any one single numbered bank account right now, you shouldn't. You should have it spread out to below that number. In fact, because they can change the rules anytime they want, remember it was in 2009, during that part of the banking crisis, that FDIC bumped the deposit insurance limit from 100,000 to 250. So they changed the rules in the right direction. That's great. Nothing to prevent them from changing it in the wrong direction. So personally, I think you should be keeping much less than 250,000 in any individual account, because if you have more than that, you will lose it in a bail-in procedure if your bank gets in trouble. That's all happened very carefully. It's happened behind the scenes. It happened after the Brisbane G20 meeting last year, where all the G20 countries said, yeah, let's enshrine the bail-in procedures. That's the opposite of a bailout. A bailout means public money comes and helps a bank out that's in trouble. A bail-in, the bank just taps into whatever funds are actually stored there. Those are also called deposits. And the other thing that got snuck in the United States is part of the bail-in procedures, which is just really disgusting. It's called the Citi Amendment, because Citibank worked hard to get it passed, which was that the banks wanted any derivative exposures that they might have when the bank goes belly up. They want those to be paid off in a senior claim fashion to any of what they call unsecured creditors, which, wink, wink, that's anybody with a bank account. You are technically an unsecured creditor of the bank. You're low man on the totem pole. So when the bank goes belly up and they don't have enough funds to make good on anything the bank might owe, they pay it out in order. Senior bondholders right at the top, but derivatives not that far below that. You as the bank account holder, the way down at the bottom of the list, pretty close to the bottom. So people need to be aware of that, when you put money in the bank, they don't have it. They usually loan it out right away. And B, you're an unsecured creditor you don't have your money in a bank. It is a loan you made to the bank, no different than if you made a loan to your drunken uncle who just got out of prison. I mean, they're both entities and you gave money to them, and your claims depend on what the legal system will entitle you to pursue. So here, I think that people, my own personal way I respond to this is I don't have any of my money in a major commercial bank. I have them all in smaller banks that are local that I understand, and I can look at their balance sheet. I can read their annual report. I can talk to the president. I know, what their prospects are. And none of them are carrying derivatives on their books. And I don't have it in just one bank. All of my banks are wired up with electronic funds transfer. So if I did get concerned, I could more readily and easily skip funds from point A to point B. And then finally in this story, keeping hard physical cash out of the bank. just makes sense. 3 months worth of living expenses, minimum, maybe more, depending. Because what's the cost? Well, you have a risk of it being stolen or burned in a house fire, but you're not losing any interest income from having it at the bank instead. So that's sort of my complete download on how I think about banking right now.
So, Chris, let me just get this straight. So what you're saying is those people who have their cash, they go to a job, they get paid, it's deposited into the bank. They're low man on the totem pole, and they actually put money into the bank.
Yep.
And you're saying that they might not be able to get their funds out of the bank.
Correct. So if the bank goes into receivership, which is technically when the bank gets in trouble, what happens is the FDIC swoops in, depending on if there was any thoughts of fraud or theft or something like that, maybe the FBI too, but they always close it on the weekend, sometimes a Friday night. And by Monday, you can't get to the branch. And all the funds are frozen with any of the accounts associated with that. So ATMs in another city still won't give you access to your accounts. And then once that's all frozen, you have no access to your funds until the process gets resolved in one shape or another. And the resolution processes now include, it's a legal process, and there's winners and losers. And when a bank goes into receivership, the only question is who's going to eat the losses. Of course, the banks have been working very hard to make sure that they're not the ones eating the losses in this story. So banks want to be sure any counterparty bets they've made with another bank, that those are honored first before any funds that are held at the bank are able to be released to the depositors.
So what about the FDIC insurance? So if I have, $50,000 or $80,000 in the bank, will that protect me?
It should, as long as we have a relatively low number of bank failures going on at any one time. Last I checked, this number could be wrong, but last I checked, FDIC had about $25 billion in the pool to pay out those claims. And that's not a lot of money when you're putting it up against a banking system that's holding, I'm again using very old numbers here, but about $10 trillion in demand deposits. So you look at it, the FDIC could potentially insure a fraction of a percent of the total number of banks going out of business. The idea is that they all wouldn't. The other idea is that, the Fed would ride in and print money, or we would do something. There would be bailouts if necessary. It would be a pretty long road before we got to the point where I think anybody's in real danger of losing sub $250,000 amounts right now. But that could change, and that's why I do what I do. It's why you do what you do. We have to pay attention to this, because you just put one or two key bank failures on the table, and all of a sudden I'm going to be alerting my subscribers to the idea that, hey, this is dodgy. I don't even trust my own local bank. Get some cash out. But guess what we're seeing now? Newspapers are full of opinion pieces by very senior people talking about how we need to move to a cashless society, specifically to prevent you from being able to do what I just said.
And we see that all over the place. We see it in Europe. We see it here in the U.S. where they're saying, let's get rid of the 100, let's get rid of the 50, let's just keep 20s and 10s around and the smaller bills. And I guess it's so people don't run to the bank and start taking out tons and tons of currency before they can go and take your funds.
Yeah.
So we've been hearing the Fed talk about an economic shock, where they came out with a report where they're saying if there is another economic shock crisis, they are prepared to do up to $4 trillion worth of QE. Now, let me ask you, why would the Fed, if the president is out there, the Fed is out there, the corporate media is out there, they're telling us that everything is fine, the economy is doing well, why are they coming out with a report telling us that they're going to be doing QE if there is some type of shock to the system?
Yeah. Always follow what people do before what they say, but in this case, I'll follow what they're saying as well. In this story, we have to note that the amount of liquidity that central banks are providing to the global financial system has never been higher. It's surpassed the levels of 2009. And so right now, the Fed is sort of holding pat on its giant balance sheet, but they've passed the baton. Europe, 85 billion euros a month of corporate asset purchases going on. Japan vacuumed up the entire Japanese government bond market, and enough of their equity market that they are now a top 10 holder of the equities of some of the companies in Japan. So we're looking at this and we say, well, why would central banks be doing these sorts of things unless there was some kind of emergency going on. What those numbers tell me is that there's deflation, it's happening, and to prevent it, what the central banks have to do is they have to be putting about $180 billion a month of fresh liquidity into the system to fight that tide, right? And so the Fed has just come out and said, oh yeah, and if it goes even higher, we're good for another 4 trillion. Trust me, they'd be good to 40 trillion if that's what it took. They're just saying we'll do whatever it takes. And further, Janet Yellen said, and hey, maybe we should think about other assets, wink, wink, right? And now there's position pieces out about how maybe the ECB should be buying equities as well. Listen, here's the story. Central banks print money out of thin air right now because they're unchecked and the political system is broken all across the globe, doesn't know how to combat the banks. The Federal Reserve is now the largest landlord in America. The Bank of Japan is now one of the largest, most concentrated equity holders of Japanese equities. The European Central Bank is by far the largest single holder of corporate debt and also of sovereign debt over there. So the central banks make money out of thin air and they're buying all the real stuff. Just hop, skip, and a jump, carry that story forward a few more years, and we've allowed entities that print money out of thin air to buy up everything that's real, and we all work for them. That's what's actually happening here. It needs to be discussed.
Right now, all of the toxic real estate that you're saying back in 2008, which the Fed now has on its books, they own all this real estate.
Yeah, $1.78 trillion worth.
So
it's a big number.
So they're landlords to all of that, and they're continually and banks, the Bank of Japan, the ECB, they're buying equities, they're buying corporate bonds, they're continually buying assets, and this is what you're saying right now. They're taking their worthless paper and they're purchasing real stuff, and they now will control pretty much, I guess, everything, right?
Well, absolutely. So Japan's central bank hasn't done this yet, but it's only a matter of time, I think, before it does happen, where when you're a top shareholder in a company, you have the right to sit on the board of directors. So the Bank of Japan could easily say, well, we need some representatives sitting on the board of Sony, Toyota, all the places that we bought, because, hey, we're a majority or a significant size shareholder. This is literally, it's exactly what happened with the Soviet Politburo. It's just got a different name on it, right? This is an appointed, not elected, an appointed group of people who have tremendous power to dictate the conditions of the economy and in the economy in which they live. Now, it's different mechanism in, old communism versus this so-called air quotes here, capitalism, but think about that, where Japan has a central bank that has the right to print money out of thin air and then get itself board seats. And if it does that long enough, eventually it will end up owning all of the productive enterprises. And how would it be allowed to own all of those when all it actually did was turn a metaphorical crank on a printing press, which actually only involves hitting a few keystrokes now. Tick, 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 tick. Hey, I own Toyota. That's totally cool. Let me put my people on it. Let me stock the board with all my friends and family, or whatever the process is. It's an astonishing thing that we've allowed banks to get this far into the system, where they are now actively buying the hard, real assets, the productive assets of a nation. They were supposed to just be administering the money supply, and of the mandate, camel nose under the tent style has broadened, but nobody's talking about it. Like, should the Fed be the largest single landlord in America? Does that even make sense? And the answer is no, of course not. Absolutely not. No way.
It doesn't really make any sense whatsoever. And let me ask you this. A lot of people are looking to this fall right now. I mean, we have elections coming up. We have the economy it's deteriorating. Things aren't getting better. We're looking at GDP, manufacturing, retail, unemployment. A lot of it's manipulated, but we can see that around the world globally, everything is contracting right now. What's your time frame when you look at all this? When do you think that this is going to start rapidly to fall apart?
Well, unfortunately, that's an unanswerable question. Fundamentally, this should have fallen apart a long time ago. The truth is that it is falling apart on a real basis. I guess, if I could reinterpret your question, it's when do we see this show up in the prices in the markets? And the answer to that is, I don't know, because the central banks are manipulating these markets very, very heavily. They're distorting them very, very heavily. They manipulate them overtly in ways we understand, covertly in ways that most people are still loath to recognize, but I see it in the tape every day. And so, yes, we live in an increasing command and control environment. Here's the risk. Here's the thing that I want to tell your listeners, that I tell my own. When this does fall apart, though, it's not going to be because the central banks have said, well, maybe we've gone too far. Let's just pull back and let nature take its course. It won't be that. They will do whatever it takes to prevent themselves. They'll be in full denial right up the end, thinking they're masters of the universe. They can control everything, that it makes sense for the Bank of Japan to own 10% of Toyota or whatever's going on. They'll do that until it falls apart for other reasons, right? And later, historians will dig back and say, oh, it's because the Archduke got shot. We don't know why things happen, right? It's like we point to something, but really the tinder is being laid here for a very large bonfire. I think that when this does go, it goes very rapidly. I don't know if it's because of a shooting war that starts, a cyber war that starts, some crazy natural phenomenon that triggers it. It's a random statement by a German finance minister. Who knows? When bubbles burst, they just burst. And this is the mother of all bubbles. We don't just have a housing bubble. That's a side bubble. We don't just have an equity bubble, also a side bubble. We have a debt bubble that was born in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and it's been running. And that's what started to burst in 2008. And that's what the central banks did everything in their power to prevent from bursting, because they didn't want to recognize the reality. But the high-level synopsis is we were growing. The whole world was growing our debt at twice the rate the income was growing. Doesn't work. It's a math problem. So they're doing everything they can to prevent that. They're just like an alcoholic who doesn't want to read the signs. They're thinking to themselves, we should find dogs that don't sleep in the driveway so I won't run over them anymore or something, right? They've got this crazy thinking in their head. But when this breaks, it's going to break really rapidly and really suddenly. And people who don't have a plan, who aren't already partly removed from that avalanche when it comes down, if they aren't already partly out of the way of that, they're just going to get flattened by this. It's going to be very vicious, very, very sudden, and very disruptive. And if it doesn't end in war, I'll be really surprised.
Now, you're telling me this is going to come down really, really fast. A lot of people ask, how long do you think it will last? How long do you think the system will last in a collapse type of phase?
Well, there'll always be some sort of a rebound. I actually think this will be it's going to take a long time to sort this out and really begin to pick ourselves back up from it for a variety of really intricate reasons, not least of which is we just don't have the quality of the resources we had in times past. Net energy per capita is falling right now. Energy is the lifeblood of the economy. We don't have what we used to have. And there's a longer, complex story about where we really are in the energy story. But let's just say that, after World War II, there was this great destruction across the world, and then there was this huge boom of building, and we not only rebuilt very rapidly, but got ourselves across the world to a higher state of being than we were before the war. And people looked at that and said, oh, well, wars are kind of destructive, but look, they're also stimulative, and we rebounded, and they're ignoring that there were sufficient ample resources for that, to do that. My prediction is that when this next collapse happens, we'll rebound. It will probably be a 10-year period of ugliness, I think. And when we do rebound, we won't rebound to quite the same heights we were at before, because the resources simply aren't there to do that. That's a form of slow, long collapse that I think is coming. And of course, this is just by what we call conventional living standards. I personally think we're going to have a better quality of life. I think people can actually enjoy life more in that new future. We won't need quite as much junk coming from China to make us happy. Maybe we have a cell phone for 10 years instead of 1 year, whatever. It's just a lower consumption lifestyle. I'm not at all in fear of it, thinking it's going to be a bad thing, but the current way things are organized, I can make a pretty strong case we're never going to be able to get back to the relative ease of the times we're in right now, because we've borrowed too much from the future, and we have to repay that either with diminished living standards in the future or a ruined currency system in the present. One of those two things has to happen. You either pay it back or you don't. And if you don't, the currency system gets ruined. Listen, just look at Venezuela if you want to understand just how traumatic that is, how Venezuela is going to be digging out of that hole for a very long time. We're going to measure this in a decade or more. And even then, people will look back and say, it didn't quite get back to how awesome it was, in the mid-90s. I don't know why, right? Because they're missing the resource part of the story.
How do people prepare for this? What should they do?
Well, the book Prosper, which you mentioned at the beginning, is a great place to start. We talk about all the financial preparations people should do, financial capital, very important. There are 7 other forms of capital that we think people should be building into their lives today, which will, by the way, improve your life today and make you more resilient should certain future scenarios unfold. So these other forms of capital include things like living capital, right? The garden I see when I look out the window, or my own body's health. Those are my versions of living capital. Building those up makes me more resilient and happier today. Material capital, right? I've got a lot of material things sort of built into my homestead. I take financial capital and I put it into thicker insulation, better windows, solar, hot water, and photovoltaic systems, things like that are built infrastructure. I'd rather have the solar hot water system on my roof than $8,000 in the bank, right? So it's trading one for the other. Emotional capital is a softer one that we talk about in there. It's actually the most important one. So I mentioned this is going to be nasty, brutish, and fast, when it does come. People who don't have the emotional resilience to be able to manage that process will find that their reactions to the economic downturn or financial panics, their reactions are going to be what hurt them the most, not the actual downturns themselves. So people who are unprepared, don't have the resilience to, or feel crushed when things happen, don't have a plan. There's lots of things we can do to become more emotionally resilient. And so that's a whole chapter in that book. Social capital, another one, very important, not just how many people you know, but how well. And building your social capital is something that's exceedingly important. And I mentioned, these other 4 forms along with financial capital, because a lot of times people say, Chris, I hear you, talking about being resilient. I've studied it. It takes money. I don't have any. I just mentioned 4 that don't take any money, really, a lot of money. You can build up material capital even just by tapping into the great wall of stuff that's flying by on FreeCycle, or if you're patient on Craigslist. We live in a country that's just awash in stuff, right? So there are ways for people, even without money, who live in cities to build their resilience up. So Prosper is about all the different ways that people can think about building up their own personal resilience across 8 different forms of capital. And if you do that, maybe you'll be like me and my co-author Adam Taggart. We count ourselves as happier, healthier, more well-connected, living more fuller, more enriched lives. We feel connected and alive, and hey, we're more resilient too. So that's been our approach to all of this. It's not, I don't want anybody to do things out of fear. I'd rather have them do them out of the idea that this improves both their current circumstances and possibly their future ones too.
Chris, thank you for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work?
They come to peakprosperity.com. That's P-E-A-K, like a mountain peak. And all of our work is there, and we have most of our information is public. We also have a subscription newsletter for people who want to go a little deeper and also have access to alerts, which I send very rarely, but if I did, I send them to my subscribers.
Once again, Chris, thank you for being on the Spotlight.
My pleasure.